He brought his lover to my poor father's funeral. Shocked when the will was read, Naomi Caldwell was 41 years old the morning she buried her father in the red clay earth of Atlanta, Georgia, and watched her husband arrive at the graveside with a woman who was not a cousin and not a colleague and not anyone she had ever been introduced to, standing close to him in a black dress that had not been worn to mourn anyone. To the people who knew Naomi, she looked like what she had always appeared to be, a woman with a county job, a modest house, a sensible coat, and the kind of grief on her face that asked nothing from anyone. Her husband Terence had stood beside the grave with his hands folded in front of him, and afterward placed his palm on her shoulder in the way of a man performing condolence rather than feeling it, and she had allowed it because that afternoon was not the afternoon for what she knew. What Terence did not know, what he had never thought to investigate in 9 years of marriage. Because a man who underestimates a woman rarely examines his assumptions, was that her father had spent 40 years making quiet decisions that nobody outside his attorney's office had ever been informed about. Naomi had been named executor of an estate valued at $1. $4 million, built from rental properties and a long-held parcel of commercial land in Gwinnett County that her father had purchased for almost nothing in 1987 and held without fanfare ever since. She had no idea Terence was already planning to contest it. What happened when the will was read would cost him everything he thought grief had handed him. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning light came in through the east window of her father's kitchen the way it always had, slanted and warm, and arriving in exactly the same place on the linoleum floor that it had arrived every morning for the 40 years her father had lived in this house. Naomi stood at the counter with a dishcloth in her hand and her coffee going cold beside her. Looking at that patch of light the way you look at something you have taken for granted your entire life and are only now understanding you will not see again in quite this way. The house still smelled like him. That was the part she was not prepared for. She had repaired the back porch of this house herself 7 years ago, when her father's knees had gotten bad enough that he could not manage the warped boards without risk. She had driven down from her apartment in Decatur on a Saturday with her tools in the bed of her truck and spent the better part of 2 days replacing the decking board by board, measuring carefully, cutting clean, fitting each piece flush against the next the way her father had taught her to do any job that was worth doing. He had sat in the yard in his lawn chair and watched, and offered exactly 2 pieces of advice across the entire 2 days, which was his ratio for everything. Mostly silence, then the precise word at the precise moment. He had been a civil engineer for the Atlanta Public Works Department for 37 years. He had built things that held. He had taught Naomi to do the same. She was a logistics director for a regional freight company, a title that did not sound like much at the table her husband's family gathered around, and she had never corrected that impression. She managed 14 distribution routes across 3 states, a budget of $6 million annually, and a team of 42 people who trusted her the way teams trust a person who is always where she says she will be and never asks for anything she has not already given. She had inherited from her father not only the profession of precision, but the disposition of reserve. She did not explain herself to rooms that had not asked. Only her father's attorney, a man named Wendell Okafor, who had handled her father's affairs for 22 years and knew every number in every column, held the full picture. Terence Caldwell had come into her life at a church fundraiser in Decatur 9 years before, charming in the particular way of men who have understood early that warmth, when performed with consistency, reads as character. He had brought food and stayed to help clean up, and she had noticed that, and she had let herself be noticed in return. He was in mortgage lending, which gave him a fluency with financial language that had initially impressed her, and which she now understood had also given him a fluency with what questions to ask and which ones to carefully avoid. He had asked her early on whether she was close with her father, and she had said yes, very, and he had said that was important, that family mattered. He had meant something by that. She understood it now. The marriage had been warm for the first 4 years, and then it became a marriage in which warmth was produced on schedule rather than felt, and Naomi had noticed the difference the way you notice a change in a building's temperature before you can identify its source. The first thing she registered and filed without comment was a phone call she overheard from the hallway of their house 3 months before her father's first hospitalization. Terrence's voice, lower than his normal register, saying, "Not yet, she doesn't know." She had stood in the hallway for 2 seconds and then walked into the kitchen and poured herself water and said nothing. She was a logistics director. She understood that information moved most freely when the people carrying it did not know they were being observed. She filed it. She waited. She watched. Her father's decline came faster than anyone had prepared for. He went into the hospital in October with what appeared to be fatigue and came out in November with a diagnosis that required more careful attention, and by February he was no longer managing the stairs without help. Naomi drove to Atlanta every weekend. She sat with him in the evenings. She brought food she had cooked on Friday night and heated on Saturday morning, and they ate together at his kitchen table the way they always had, slowly, without hurry, talking about whatever was in front of them without needing to make it significant. One of those Saturdays in January, her father set down his fork and looked at her with the particular focus that he reserved for things he had been thinking about longer than the moment required. He said, "Wendell has everything in order. You know where to find him." She said she knew. He said, "Your grandfather told me once that a man who builds quietly will never have to shout when the time comes." She looked at her father's hands across the table and thought that she had always known him to be right about the things that mattered, and that this was probably one of those things. He passed on a Thursday morning in March, quietly, the way he had lived. Terrence drove with her to Atlanta. At the funeral home, he was attentive and present in the way that he was capable of being when an audience was watching. At the grave, he stood correctly and said the correct things to the correct people. And then, 20 minutes into the graveside service, a car arrived that Naomi had not been expecting, and a woman got out of the passenger side that Naomi had never seen before. And Terrence's expression changed for precisely 1/2 of 1 second in a way that he controlled quickly, but not quickly enough for a woman who had been watching him for 9 years to miss. Her face remained perfectly calm. She stood at her father's graveside and received the condolences of 47 people and thanked each one of them, and gave none of her attention to the woman in the black dress who stood at the perimeter of the gathering with her eyes moving between Terrence and the ground. She filed it, the way she always filed things that were not yet fully understood, cleanly, completely, with the intention of returning. The night after the burial, in her father's house where she was staying for the week, she sat at his kitchen table in the dark with her laptop and the particular focus of a woman who has been waiting to look at something and is now ready to look. She had access to their joint account through her own banking credentials. She exported 14 months of statements. She opened a spreadsheet. She started at the earliest entry and moved forward in the methodical, unhurried way she moved through any logistics problem, inventory first, then route, then cost. Her hands did not shake. What she found across those 14 months was not hidden in the way that people who believe they are being clever hide things. It was distributed, spaced at irregular intervals that were meant to look like ordinary spending, cash withdrawals on Tuesday afternoons, a restaurant charge in a neighborhood she had never been to with him, a hotel rate on a Friday in September, when he had told her he was at a conference in Savannah. A pattern of gift purchases from a jeweler on Peachtree Street, 3 of them over 8 months, in amounts between $200 and $600. She cross-referenced dates against the shared calendar they maintained on the refrigerator at home. Not one of the discrepancies fell on a date she had been with him. He had been doing this for at minimum 14 months. She built a timeline in a column labeled simply, Record. She printed it. She placed it in a folder. She placed the folder in the zipper pocket of her laptop bag, and she closed her laptop, and she sat in her father's kitchen in the dark for a long while, listening to the house settle around her the way old houses do, breathing and adjusting, holding themselves together through nothing more than the accumulated intention of the person who built them. She thought about what her father had said at the table in January. She picked up her phone and called Wendell Okafor. He answered on the second ring. She said, "I need to see you. Not about the estate, about something else first." Wendell Okafor had known Naomi since she was 11 years old, which meant he had known her longer than Terence Caldwell had known her, and with considerably more accuracy. He was 66 years old, precise in language and unhurried in manner, and he had managed her father's affairs with such discretion over 2 decades that most people in their circle did not know he existed. He received Naomi in his office on a Monday morning, poured her coffee from a pot he kept on the credenza, and listened without interruption while she laid out what she had found. When she finished, he looked at the printed timeline for a long moment and then set it down. "He came to see me," Wendell said. Naomi looked at him. 8 weeks ago. He called my office and said he was the executor's spouse and wanted to understand the estate structure. I told him the estate was not his matter and ended the call. Wendell folded his hands. "I should have told you then. I weighed whether it was appropriate. I decided it was not my information to pass. I am telling you now because you have asked." Naomi was quiet for a moment. "He was positioning," she said. "Yes," Wendell said. "That is what it looked like." He told her what the estate contained, which she already knew in broad terms, and then told her what Terence clearly did not know, that the will had been structured with a no-contest clause her father had insisted upon after a conversation with Wendell 3 years prior. Any beneficiary who challenged the will's terms in court would forfeit their interest entirely. Terence was not a beneficiary. He was a spouse, which under Georgia law entitled him to certain claims on marital assets. But the estate assets, held through a trust her father had established 16 years ago, were not marital property. The commercial parcel in Gwinnett County, the 6 rental properties across DeKalb and Fulton counties, the carefully maintained portfolio that Wendell had helped her father structure over 2 quiet decades, none of it was reachable by a spouse's claim. Terence had gone to Wendell's office expecting a door he could open. He had found a wall. Preparation outlasts impatience. Her father had understood that before she was born. The following Saturday, Naomi drove back to Atlanta and spent the afternoon with her Aunt Rosalie, her father's youngest sister, who had lived 3 streets away from him for 30 years and who had sat with Naomi every evening of the funeral week without being asked and without saying very much, which was the most useful thing anyone had done. Rosalie was 68, a retired schoolteacher with a particular clarity of observation that comes from decades of watching young people think they were being subtle. She poured sweet tea at her kitchen table and listened while Naomi told her about the woman at the grave and the 14 months of statements and Wendell's call. When Naomi finished, Rosalie was quiet in the way her father had always been quiet, not out of emptiness, out of consideration. "That woman," Rosalie said. "She was at the church." Before the service, I saw her speaking with Terence in the side hall when he thought no one was looking. She paused. I thought maybe she was someone from his office. I did not think to mention it. She looked at Naomi steadily. Your father used to say that a patient person does not need to rush because they have already done the work. He said it to me when I was young and impatient and thought it was advice about cooking. She set down her glass. It was not about cooking. Naomi drove home that evening with the folder in her bag and her father's voice in her ear, and the particular steadiness of a woman who knows exactly what the next step is and is in no hurry to take it before the time is right. Wendell also did something she had not asked him to do, which was reach out to a financial investigator he had used in prior estate disputes to perform a background review on Terence Caldwell's professional record. What came back was instructive. There was a complaint filed with the State Mortgage Licensing Board 3 years prior by a client who alleged that Terence had directed loan fees toward a third-party processing service in which he held an undisclosed financial interest. The complaint had been resolved without formal action, which meant without admission, which also meant it was still on record for anyone who knew to look. There was a second name on the Processing Services Incorporation documents, a woman named Brenda Cole, who shared an address with a unit in a Buckhead apartment complex that showed up on 2 of the hotel receipts Naomi had already documented. The picture that emerged was not complicated. It was only thorough, and thoroughness had always been the one thing that people who underestimated Naomi had never thought to prepare for. She added the investigator's findings to the folder. She labeled it with a single word and closed it and put it in her bag and did not open it again until she needed to. Real power operated in quiet rooms. 3 days later, she sat across from Terence at the dinner table and asked him how his week had been and listened to him talk about a refinancing deal that had moved slowly, and she refilled his water glass, and she was so entirely ordinary in every movement that he had no reason to look at her carefully. And he did not. He was performing for an audience of one who was no longer in the room he thought she was in. The will reading took place on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after the burial in Wendell Okafor's conference room on the 14th floor of a building in Midtown Atlanta. The room had a long mahogany table and 2 windows that faced north, letting in a gray and even light. Wendell sat at the head of the table. Naomi sat to his right. Her Aunt Rosalie sat beside her, at Naomi's request, as a family witness. Terence arrived 4 minutes early with an attorney Naomi recognized as someone who specialized in estate disputes, which told her everything she needed to know about what he had expected this morning to produce. He sat down across from her and looked at Wendell and nodded, professionally, with the composure of a man who believed he held information that others in the room did not. He had no idea. Wendell read the will in full, without theater, in the measured cadence of a man who had done this many times and understood that clarity was the only necessary quality of the moment. The trust structure, the properties. The commercial parcel in Gwinnett County, assessed at $840,000 at current valuation. The rental portfolio, producing a combined net income of $6,200 per month. The liquid assets, the named executor, Naomi, sole executor, sole trustee. All assets held in a revocable trust established 16 years prior, predating the marriage by 7 years, and therefore not subject to equitable distribution as marital property under Georgia law. Terence's attorney leaned toward him and spoke quietly. Terence looked at Naomi. Then he straightened and said that he believed there were grounds to contest the trust structure given his contributions to the household during the marriage, and that he intended to seek a full accounting of any marital funds that had been commingled with trust assets. Wendell set down the document he was holding with the quietness of a man who had anticipated exactly this. He produced a second document. He slid it across the table. He said, The trust has maintained completely separate accounting since its establishment. There has been no commingling. What you are looking at is the independent audit conducted 18 months ago at Mr. Caldwell's request, precisely to prevent this line of argument from having any traction. He paused. There is also the no contest clause, which your attorney will want to review before you proceed further. Any challenge to the terms forfeits whatever standing the challenger believed they had. Terrence's attorney read the clause. His expression did not change, but his posture did. Terrence looked at his attorney. His attorney looked at the table. Terrence looked at Naomi and said her name the way people say a name when they are trying to locate the version of a person they thought they knew. He said he was sorry about her father. He said they could talk through this. He said this did not have to be what it was becoming. Naomi looked at him for a long, even moment. My father built this quietly for 40 years, she said. He never talked about what he had. He just did the work and kept the records and trusted that it would matter when it needed to. She folded her hands on the table. You sat across from him at his table and shook his hand and looked at this family and saw something you thought you could eventually reach. You had 9 years to decide who you actually were. That decision is made now. It belongs to you. She pushed back her chair. She picked up her bag. She nodded to Wendell. She touched her aunt's hand briefly as she passed. She walked out. She did not look back at the room she was leaving. Her father had built everything worth keeping. She intended to honor that. 6 months passed the way grief passes when you let it move at its own pace, not quickly, not cleanly, but forward. Naomi stood in the backyard of her father's house on a Saturday morning in September. Her hands in the soil of the garden bed she had cleared and turned and planted in the weeks after the estate transferred fully into her care. She had decided to keep the house, not to rent it, not to hold it purely as an asset, but to be in it in the weekends and the summers, to let it remain what it had always been. The place her father had built and maintained and loved without spectacle for 4 decades. She had repainted the back porch railing herself, the same cream color her father had always kept it. And the boards she had replaced 7 years ago were still solid underfoot, which gave her a satisfaction she did not try to articulate. A man named Calvin Rhodes had started appearing in the periphery of her life in the way that good people sometimes appear, unannounced and without agenda. He was a contractor she had hired to repair the roof of one of her father's rental properties, quiet and competent, who had given her an honest estimate and completed the work exactly on schedule, and then asked her at the end of the job whether she had a preference in coffee because he had noticed her cup every time he came to review the work. She had told him she did, and he had laughed, and that was where it started. He was not performing for her. He was simply present when she needed someone to be present, which was more than most people managed. She heard about Terrence the way she heard about most things that were no longer her concern, at a distance, through people who offered the information without knowing how little she required it. His attorney had withdrawn after the no contest clause foreclosed any productive challenge. He had left the house they had shared and was renting a room from a colleague in Marietta. His position at the mortgage firm had become complicated when a colleague, cross-referencing a property transaction, had noticed a discrepancy in a client file that bore Terrence's signature. The inquiry was still open. The woman from the funeral had relocated out of state, which Naomi knew because a mutual acquaintance mentioned it without knowing the context, and she had registered the information and moved on without comment. His brother had not returned his calls in 3 months. That was the detail that told the full story. Naomi pressed the seedling into the dark soil with 2 fingers and smoothed the earth around it and sat back on her heels and looked at the yard her father had tended for 40 years. The oak tree he had planted the year she was born was enormous now, full and deeply rooted, throwing shade across half the yard in a wide, unhurried arc. Her father had always said he planted it for the shade it would one day provide, not the shade it provided then, which meant he was already thinking about the future when he put it in the ground. That was who he was. She pressed another seedling in, and then another, and worked her way down the bed slowly and without hurry, the way he had taught her to do any work that was worth doing. Freedom was the real currency. Everything else was just the accounting. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.